Margaret Sullivan stood on the wooden platform of Willow Creek train station, her heart beating so fast she could hear it in her ears. The September morning air carried the smell of dust and prairie grass, mixed with the distant scent of coal smoke from the approaching train. She smoothed down her best blue dress, the one she had saved for months to buy back in Chicago. Today was supposed to be the most important day of her life. In her gloved hands, she held a letter that had changed everything. The paper was soft. From being folded and unfolded so many times, the ink slightly faded from her nervous fingers, tracing over the words again and again. Thomas Whitmore had written those words 3 months ago, promising to meet her at this very station. He had asked her to be his wife, to start a new life together in the growing town of Denver. Margaret had read that letter until she knew every word by heart. Thomas had written about his general store, about the little house behind it where they would live, about how lonely he was and how much he needed a good woman by his side. He had seen her photograph through a mutual friend and said her kind. Eyes had captured his heart immediately. The train whistle blew in the distance, and Margaret's stomach jumped. She had traveled for 3 days to get here, selling almost everything she owned to pay for the ticket. The textile factory where she worked had closed down, and with no family left in Chicago, Thomas's proposal had seemed like a gift from heaven. A chance to start over. To build something beautiful with someone who wanted her. As the black locomotive came into view, chugging and puffing white steam into the clear morning sky, Margaret checked her appearance one more time in the small mirror. From her purse. Her brown hair was pinned up neatly, and despite the long journey, she still looked presentable. She wanted Thomas to be proud of her, to see that he had made the right choice. The train pulled into the station with a great hissing of steam and grinding of metal wheels on the tracks. Margaret stepped closer to the platform edge, her eyes scanning every window for a familiar face. Thomas had sent her a photograph, too, showing a pleasant-looking man with kind eyes and a neat mustache. She had studied that picture every night before bed, imagining their wedding day, their first dinner together, the conversations they would have. The train stopped with a final screech, and passengers began stepping down onto the platform. Margaret watched each person carefully. An elderly woman with a walking stick, a young family with 2 small children, a businessman in a dark suit carrying a heavy case. But no Thomas. She waited as more people got off. Her eyes moved from face to face, hoping to see that familiar smile from the photograph. A few men got off who looked somewhat like Thomas, but when they saw her hopeful expression, they simply walked past toward the town. Margaret's heart began to sink, but she told herself to be patient. Maybe Thomas was in one of the rear cars. Maybe he had been delayed and would come out any moment. The conductor, a friendly man with gray whiskers, called out, "All aboard!" for the passengers continuing their journey. Margaret approached him quickly, her voice trembling slightly. "Excuse me, sir," she said, pulling out Thomas's photograph. "Have you seen this man? He was supposed to meet me here today." The conductor looked at the picture carefully, then shook his head. "Sorry, miss, haven't seen him on this train or any other this week." "You sure about the date?" Margaret nodded, though doubt was starting to creep into her mind. "Yes, September 15th, he said. He would be here." The conductor's expression softened with sympathy. "Well, maybe he'll be on the next train. There's another one at 3:15 this afternoon, and then the evening train at 7:30. Margaret thanked him and stepped back as the train pulled away, leaving her alone on the platform. The morning sun was getting warmer, and she found a wooden bench in the shade where she could sit and think. She pulled out Thomas's letter again, reading it carefully to make sure she hadn't misunderstood anything. The letter was clear. September 15th, 1887, Willow Creek Station, 10:30 in the morning. There was no mistake. As the hours passed, Margaret began to notice the small details of the town around her. Willow Creek was smaller than she had expected, with a main street, but she could see from the station. There was a general store, a saloon, a small church with a white steeple, and a few houses scattered around. It was the kind of place where everyone probably knew everyone else's business. A few townspeople walked past the station, and Margaret caught them glancing at her curiously. She realized she must look out of place in her fine city clothes, sitting alone with her traveling bag beside her. But she didn't care. Thomas would come, and then everything would be wonderful. At 3:15, the afternoon train arrived. Margaret stood up eagerly, her heart racing again. But as passenger after passenger stepped off, there was still no sign of Thomas. She showed his photograph to the conductor of this train too, but got the same answer. No one had seen him. By evening, Margaret was starting to feel truly worried. She had eaten nothing since a small breakfast that morning, and her mouth was dry from the dusty wind, but she couldn't leave the station. What if Thomas came and she wasn't there? What if he thought she had changed her mind? The 7:30 train came and went with the same disappointing result. As darkness fell over the small town, Margaret finally had to admit that Thomas wasn't coming today. But surely he would come tomorrow. Maybe he had gotten sick, or his business had kept him away. There could be 100 reasons why he was delayed. She picked up her bag and walked toward the town, looking for somewhere to spend the night. The boarding house sign caught her eye immediately. Mrs. Henderson's boarding house. Clean rooms. Good meals. It looked respectable and safe. Mrs. Henderson was a kind woman in her 50s, who took one look at Margaret's tired face and immediately offered her a room and a hot meal. Over supper, Margaret explained that she was waiting for her fiancés to arrive by train, and Mrs. Henderson nodded understandingly. "I'm sure he'll be here tomorrow, dear," she said gently. "Sometimes these things just get delayed." That night, Margaret lay in the narrow bed staring at the ceiling. She could hear the wind blowing across the prairie outside, and the sound made her feel very small and alone. She thought about her old life in Chicago, the job she had given up, the few friends she had said goodbye to. Everything she had known was behind her now, and her future depended on Thomas keeping his promise. She fell asleep holding his letter close to her heart, dreaming of the life they would build together. Margaret woke up on her second morning in Willow Creek with the same mixture of hope and anxiety that had kept her tossing all night. The sunlight streaming through the small window of her room at Mrs. Henderson's boarding house told her it was already past 7 o'clock. She had planned to be at the station by 8, giving herself plenty of time before the first train arrived. She dressed carefully in the same blue dress, though it was starting to show signs of wear from the journey and the dusty prairie air. Her savings were limited, and she had packed only 2 other dresses, saving the best one for her wedding day. As she brushed her hair and pinned it up, she tried to push away the worried thoughts that had plagued her through the night. Mrs. Henderson was already busy in the kitchen when Margaret came downstairs. The older woman looked up from her morning baking with a warm smile that didn't quite hide the concern in her eyes. "Good morning, dear. I've made some fresh biscuits and coffee. You'll want a good breakfast before you head to the station." Margaret sat at the wooden table where 2 other boarders, both traveling salesmen, were already eating. They nodded politely but seemed to sense she wasn't in the mood for conversation. The coffee was strong and hot, exactly what she needed, but the biscuits tasted like dust in her mouth. Her stomach was too twisted with nerves to appreciate good food. "Mrs. Henderson," Margaret said quietly, "if someone wanted to send a telegram to this town, where would they send it?" "Why, to the telegraph office next to the general store, dear. Mr. Peterson runs it. Would you like me to walk you over there?" "After breakfast?" Margaret nodded gratefully. Maybe Thomas had sent word explaining his delay. Maybe there was a simple explanation for everything, and she was worrying for nothing. The walk to the telegraph office took them down the main street of Willow Creek. Margaret noticed how people looked at her curiously from their shop windows and doorways. In a town this small, a new face was probably noteworthy, especially a woman traveling alone. She kept her head high and walked with as much dignity as she could manage. Mr. Peterson was a thin man with spectacles who looked at her sympathetically. When she asked about telegrams, he checked his records carefully, but there was nothing for Margaret Sullivan. No messages, no explanations, no word from Thomas at all. "If anything comes in, I'll make sure it gets to you right away," he promised. "You staying at Mrs. Henderson's place?" Margaret nodded and thanked him, though her heart sank a little more. She walked back to the boarding house, collected her small purse, and headed for the train station. The morning air was crisp, and she could smell wood smoke from the chimneys around town. It would have been a pleasant walk if her mind hadn't been so troubled. At the station, Margaret took her place on the same bench where she had waited the day before. The wooden platform was still slightly damp with morning dew, and she could hear birds singing in the distance. The peaceful sounds of the prairie morning did little to calm her racing thoughts. The 10:30 train arrived right on schedule, and Margaret stood up expectantly. But as passengers stepped off, her heart sank once again. No Thomas, she approached the conductor with his photograph, but this man had the same answer as the others. He hadn't seen Thomas on this train or any other. After the train pulled away, Margaret sat back down on the bench. She tried to think of logical reasons for Thomas's absence. Maybe he was sick. Maybe there had been some trouble with his store. Maybe he was dealing with a family emergency. She clung to these possibilities like a lifeline. The hours between trains moved slowly. Margaret watched the sun climb higher in the sky and felt the September warmth on her face. A few townspeople passed by, some nodding politely, others just staring with obvious curiosity. She began to recognize faces: the man who ran the general store, a woman with 2 young children, an elderly gentleman who seemed to take the same walk every day. Around noon, a woman about her own age approached the bench. She was plainly dressed but clean, with kind eyes and a gentle manner. "Excuse me," the woman said softly. "I'm Ruth Miller. I live just down the street. I couldn't help but notice you've been waiting here. Is everything all right?" Margaret looked up gratefully. It was the first real conversation she'd had with anyone except Mrs. Henderson since arriving in town. "I'm waiting for my fiancé," Margaret explained. "He was supposed to meet me here yesterday, but he hasn't come yet." Ruth's expression grew sympathetic. "Oh, you poor thing. I'm sure he'll be along soon. Sometimes the trains from Denver get delayed, especially this time of year." They talked for a few more minutes, and Margaret found herself sharing more than she had intended. Ruth listened without judgment, offering the kind of comfort that only another woman could give. When Ruth left, she promised to check on Margaret again soon. The afternoon train came and went with the same disappointing result. As evening approached, Margaret realized she had spent another entire day at the station with nothing to show for it. Her feet were sore from walking back and forth on the platform, and her dress was dusty from the prairie wind. At supper that evening, Mrs. Henderson gently asked how the day had gone. Margaret tried to sound optimistic, but she could see the worry in the older woman's eyes. "Perhaps you should consider sending a telegram to this Thomas," Mrs. Henderson suggested carefully. "Just to let him know you're here safely." Margaret had thought of this, but she was reluctant to spend the money. Her savings were already running low, and she had no idea how long she might need to make them last. But Mrs. Henderson's suggestion made sense. The next morning, she would send a telegram to Thomas's store in Denver. That night, Margaret lay in bed counting her money by the light of a single candle. She had enough to pay for her room and meals for perhaps 2 more weeks if she was very careful. After that, she would have to make some difficult decisions. She tried not to think about what would happen if Thomas never came. She had no job, no family to return to, and barely enough money to survive. The textile factory in Chicago had closed permanently, and even if she could afford a ticket back, there would be nothing waiting for her there. Sleep came slowly, filled with dreams of train whistles and empty platforms. The third day followed. The same pattern. Margaret dressed, ate a small breakfast, and walked to the station. She was beginning to recognize the rhythm of the town when the shops opened, when people went about their daily errands, when the mail was delivered. She was becoming part of the scenery, a fixture on the platform that people expected to see. Some of the townspeople had started greeting her by name. Mrs. Henderson had obviously spread the word about her situation, and while Margaret appreciated their kindness, she also felt exposed. Everyone knew she was the woman waiting for a man who hadn't come. By the 4th day, Margaret's optimism was beginning to crack. She still went to the station, still watched each train hopefully, but doubt was creeping in like winter cold. She had sent the telegram to Thomas's store, but received no reply. Mr. Peterson checked for her twice a day now. Shaking his head sadly each time, Ruth Miller had started bringing her lunch to the station, simple sandwiches and coffee that Margaret accepted gratefully. They had become friends of sorts, united by the unspoken understanding that women sometimes had to depend on each other in this harsh world. "You know," Ruth said one afternoon as they sat together on the bench, "my husband might have some work at his farm if you're interested. Nothing fancy, but it would give you something to do while you wait." Margaret appreciated the offer, but she shook her head. "I can't miss the trains. What if Thomas comes and I'm not here?" Ruth didn't argue, but Margaret could see the concern in her eyes. Everyone in town seemed to understand something that Margaret wasn't ready to accept yet. By the end of the week, Margaret had developed a routine that had become as natural as breathing. Wake up, dress, eat a small breakfast, walk to the station, wait for the morning train, wait for the afternoon train, wait for the evening train, walk back to the boarding house, eat supper, go to bed, repeat. Her blue dress was becoming faded and worn, her shoes were scuffed from the daily walks on the dusty streets. But she kept going, kept hoping, kept believing that tomorrow would be the day Thomas would finally arrive and explain everything. The morning of October 12th brought the first real cold snap that Willow Creek had seen all autumn. Margaret pulled her thin shawl tighter around her shoulders as she walked to the station, her breath forming small clouds in the crisp air. 3 weeks had passed since she first arrived, and the routine had become as natural as breathing. Though each day brought a little less hope than the one before, her blue dress, once so carefully pressed and beautiful, now hung loose on her frame. She had been eating less to make her dwindling money last longer, and the worry had taken its toll. But she still pinned her hair up each morning, still walked to the station with her head held high, still believed that today might be the day Thomas would finally appear. The 10:30 train was running a few minutes late, and Margaret could hear its whistle in the distance as she settled onto her familiar bench. The wooden platform was slick with morning frost, and she could see her breath as she waited. A few other people stood nearby, Mr. Peterson waiting for mail delivery, and old Mr. Crawford, who seemed to enjoy watching the trains come and go. When the locomotive finally pulled into the station with its usual hissing and grinding, Margaret stood up out of habit more than hope. She had done this same thing dozens of times now, watching passengers step off while her heart gradually sank. But this morning felt different somehow, though she couldn't say why. The first passengers off were the usual types, a traveling salesman with his heavy case, a woman with 2 young children who looked tired from the journey, an elderly couple who seemed to be visiting family. Margaret barely glanced at them anymore, her eyes automatically scanning for Thomas's familiar face, even though she no longer really expected to see it. Then a different kind of man stepped down from the train, and Margaret found herself looking at him more carefully. He was tall and lean, with sun-weathered skin and clothes that had seen hard use. His hat was dusty, his boots were scuffed, and he carried himself with the easy confidence of someone who had spent most of his life outdoors. Everything about him spoke of long days under the open sky. Jake Morrison paused on the platform, adjusting his worn leather satchel and looking around the small town with the careful eyes of someone who had been to many places and learned to read them quickly. The cattle drive from Texas had been a disaster, half the herd lost to disease, the other half scattered by a late-season storm. He had just enough money left to get to Montana, where his brother had written about work at his ranch, but it wasn't the town that caught Jake's attention. It was the woman sitting on the bench, watching the train with an expression that made his chest tighten with recognition. He had seen that look before, in his own mirror during the dark days after his father's death. It was the look of someone trying to hold on to hope when everything inside was telling them to give up. Margaret was so focused on searching the remaining passengers that she didn't notice Jake watching her. Even when the last person stepped off and the conductor called, "All aboard?" For the continuing journey, she remained seated, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes still fixed on the train as if willing Thomas to appear. Jake found himself walking toward her before he had really decided to do so. He stopped a respectful distance away and touched the brim of his hat. "Excuse me, miss," he said in a voice roughened by years of calling to cattle across wide plains. I don't mean to intrude, but are you waiting for someone? Margaret looked up at him, and Jake was struck by how young she seemed despite the weariness in her eyes. She was pretty in a quiet way, with the kind of face that spoke of kindness and strength. But there was something fragile about her too, like a bird that had been flying too long without finding a place to rest. Yes, she said softly, her voice carrying the slight hoarseness that came from holding back tears. I'm waiting for my fiancé. He was supposed to meet me here. Jake nodded slowly. He had heard similar stories before, though usually in saloons from men who had been stood up by women, not the other way around. When was he supposed to arrive? Margaret's hands tightened on her purse. 3 weeks ago. The simple words hit Jake harder than he had expected. 3 weeks. This woman had been sitting on this bench, watching trains come and go, for 3 weeks. He had known disappointment in his life, but he couldn't imagine the particular kind of torture that would be. I'm sorry, he said, meaning it. That's a long time to wait. Margaret nodded, and Jake could see her struggling to maintain her composure. I'm sure he'll come soon. There must be a good reason for the delay. Jake looked at her for a long moment, taking in the worn dress, the careful way she held herself, the stubborn set of her jaw. She was still fighting, still believing, but he could see the battle was wearing her down. I hope you're right, he said gently. In the meantime, you take care of yourself, you hear? He touched his hat again and walked away, but something made him look back. Margaret was still sitting on the bench, still watching the empty tracks, and Jake felt a pull he couldn't explain. He had his own troubles, his own destination to reach, but something about this woman's quiet dignity made him want to help the town of Willow. Creek was small enough that finding the local boarding house wasn't difficult. Mrs. Henderson's place looked clean and respectable, exactly the kind of establishment where a traveling man could get a decent meal and a bed for the night. Jake had planned to rest his horse and then continue north, but now he found himself thinking he might stay an extra day. Mrs. Henderson was a motherly woman who welcomed him warmly and showed him to a small but comfortable room. At supper, he found himself sitting at the same table where Margaret had eaten her meals for the past 3 weeks. The other boarders were friendly enough, a patent medicine salesman and a circuit preacher who was traveling between small towns. You came in on the morning train, Mrs. Henderson said as she served him a plate of beef stew. Did you happen to notice a young woman waiting at the station? Jake nodded. I spoke to her briefly. She said she was waiting for her fiancé. Mrs. Henderson's expression grew sad. Poor Margaret. She's been waiting for nearly a month now. Sold everything she had back in Chicago to come out here, and that man hasn't shown up yet. A month? Jake's spoon paused halfway to his mouth. She told me 3 weeks. She's been here 3 weeks, but she was supposed to meet him a week before. That she's been living on nothing but hope and the little bit of money she has left. The circuit preacher shook his head sadly. It's a hard thing when people don't keep their promises. That young woman seems like a good soul. She is, Mrs. Henderson agreed. Works around the house to help pay for her room. Never complains, always polite. But I can see she's losing weight, and the worry is eating her alive. I don't think she's slept properly since she got here. Jake ate his stew slowly, thinking about Margaret's face when she had talked about her fiancé. There had been something desperate in her voice, something that suggested this man wasn't just her future husband, but her only hope for any kind of future at all. What's her situation? He asked casually. I mean, if this fellow doesn't show up? Mrs. Henderson looked around the table, then leaned forward slightly. Between you and me, I don't think she has anywhere else to go. She mentioned that the factory where she worked closed down, and she doesn't have any family. She's put all her eggs in one basket, if you know what I mean. Jake knew exactly what she meant. He had seen it before, people who had bet everything. On one chance, one dream, one person. Sometimes it worked out. Often it didn't. And when it didn't, the results could be devastating. After supper, Jake walked outside to check on his horse and think. The animal was tired but holding up well, and would be ready to travel tomorrow if needed. But as Jake stood in the cool evening air, he found himself thinking about Margaret rather than his journey to Montana. He had been raised to help people when he could, especially women who found themselves in difficult situations. His mother had taught him that a man's character was measured by how he treated those who couldn't help themselves. And something about Margaret's quiet strength in the face of disappointment reminded him of his mother's resilience during the hard years after his father's death. Jake walked back toward the boarding house. His mind made up, he would stay. Another day, maybe two. Not because he had any particular plan, but because something told him that Margaret was going to need a friend soon. And if her fiancé didn't show up, which after 3 weeks seemed increasingly likely, she was going to need more than just friendship. That night, Jake lay in his narrow bed listening to the wind blow across the prairie and thinking about the woman who had been waiting on that bench every day for 3 weeks. He had his own troubles, his own uncertain future, but he couldn't shake the feeling that their paths had crossed for a reason. Tomorrow he decided he would talk to her. Again. Jake woke up before dawn, just as he had every morning for the past 15 years. Old habits from cattle driving died hard, and his body was used to rising with the first hint of light on the horizon. He lay in the narrow bed at Mrs. Henderson's boarding house, listening to the wind whistling around the eaves and thinking about the conversation at dinner the night before. Margaret had been waiting for nearly a month. A month of sitting on that bench, watching trains come and go, hoping for a man who clearly wasn't coming. Jake had seen a lot of hard things in his life, but something about that image made his chest ache in a way he wasn't used to. He dressed quietly in the pre-dawn darkness, pulling on his worn boots and settling his hat on his head. The floorboards creaked softly under his feet as he made his way downstairs and out into the cold morning air. His breath formed clouds in the frigid air, and frost crunched under his boots as he walked through the empty streets of Willow Creek. The town was still asleep, with only a few wisps of smoke rising from early rising households. Jake had no particular destination in mind, just the need to move and think. But his feet seemed to carry him toward the train station without any conscious decision on his part. As he approached the platform, he was surprised to see a familiar figure already sitting on the bench. Margaret was there, wrapped in a thin shawl, her breath visible in the cold air. She sat perfectly still, staring down the empty tracks as if she could will a train to appear through sheer determination. Jake stopped walking, unsure whether to approach or leave her in peace. But something about her stillness, her solitude in the gray morning light, made him step forward. "You're up early," he said gently, not wanting to startle her. Margaret turned toward him, and Jake could see that. Her eyes were red-rimmed, though whether from cold or tears he couldn't tell. "I couldn't sleep," she said simply. "I thought maybe if I came early, maybe I would see something different." Jake nodded and gestured to the bench. "Mind if I sit?" Margaret moved over to make room, and Jake settled beside her, close enough to offer some warmth, but not so close as to make her uncomfortable. For a few minutes, they sat in silence, watching the eastern sky slowly lighten. "Tell me about Chicago," Jake said eventually. "What was your life like there?" Margaret was quiet for so long that Jake thought she might not answer. Then she began to speak, her voice soft but steady. "I worked in a textile factory," she said. 12 hours a day, 6 days a week. The work was hard, and the pay was barely enough to rent a tiny room and buy food. But it was honest work, and I was good at it. She paused, her fingers playing with the edge of her shawl. "I lived in a boarding house not much different from Mrs. Henderson's, except it was full of factory girls like me. We didn't have much, but we looked out for each other. When one of us got sick, the others would share their food. When someone needed a new dress for church, we'd all pitch in to buy fabric." Jake found himself picturing it, young women working. Brutal hours supporting each other through the small kindnesses that made hard lives bearable. "Sounds like you had friends there." "I did," Margaret said, and her voice grew sadder. "But when the factory closed, everyone scattered. Some went back to their families, some found work in other cities. I was the only one who didn't have anywhere to go." "No family at all?" Margaret shook her head. "My parents died when I was 16. I had an older brother, but he went west to look for gold 5 years ago. I haven't heard from him since." Jake felt something tighten in his chest. This woman had been completely alone in the world, and Thomas's letter had probably seemed like a miracle. A chance for a family, a home, a future where she wouldn't have to face everything by herself. "What about you?" Margaret asked, turning to look at him. "What's your story?" Jake was quiet for a moment, surprised by the question. People didn't usually ask cowboys about their lives, as if they assumed men like him didn't have stories worth telling. "I grew up on a small ranch in Colorado," he said finally. "My father raised cattle, and I learned everything I know from him. When he died 3 years ago, I had to sell the ranch to pay his debts. Since then, I've been working cattle drives, moving from job to job." "That must be lonely," Margaret said softly. Jake nodded. "It is. I keep thinking I'll find a place to settle down, maybe start my own ranch again. But it's hard to build something when you're always moving." They fell silent again, and Jake realized that despite their different backgrounds, they understood each other in a way that surprised him. Both of them were alone, both searching for something solid in a world that seemed determined to keep them drifting. "The cattle drive I just finished was supposed to be my chance," Jake continued. "The boss promised good money, enough to maybe buy some land. But we lost most of the herd to disease, and the rest scattered in a storm. I'm heading to Montana because my brother wrote that there's work at his ranch, but I don't know what I'll find when I get there." Margaret turned to study his face. "You're afraid he might not need you after all?" It wasn't a question, and Jake was struck by how clearly she saw the fear he hadn't even admitted to himself. "Yeah," he said simply. "I guess I am." As the morning grew lighter, other sounds began to drift across the prairie, a rooster crowing somewhere in town, the distant lowing of cattle, the creak of a windmill turning in the breeze. It was peaceful, but Jake could feel the tension in Margaret's body as the time for the morning train approached. "Margaret," he said carefully, "what will you do if Thomas doesn't come today?" She was quiet for a long time, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "I don't know," she admitted finally. "I've been trying not to think about it." "But you have to think about it," Jake said gently. "You can't wait forever." Margaret's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "I have nowhere else to go. No money for a ticket back to Chicago, and even if I did, there's nothing there for me. Thomas was my only chance at a real life." Jake felt his heart breaking for her. He had been alone plenty of times, but he had always had his skills, his ability to find work, his strength to fall back on. Margaret had none of those advantages. A woman alone in the world faced obstacles that most men never had to consider. The sound of a train whistle in the distance made them both look up. The 10:30 was approaching, right on schedule. Jake watched Margaret's face as she heard it, saw the flicker of hope that she couldn't quite suppress even after all these weeks of disappointment. "I have to watch," she said, standing up. "I know he probably won't be on it, but I have to watch." Jake stood beside her, and they waited together as the train pulled into the station. The familiar routine played out, passengers stepping off, Margaret scanning each face, the conductor calling out announcements. But once again, there was no Thomas Dot as the train pulled away. Leaving them alone on the platform, Jake saw Margaret's shoulders sag. She didn't cry, but something in her posture suggested that a little more of her hope had died. "Margaret," Jake said suddenly, his voice rougher than he intended, "I need to ask you something, and I want you to really think about your answer." She looked at him with tired eyes. "What?" Jake took a deep breath, knowing that what he was about to say would change both of their lives. "I know this isn't what you planned, and I know we barely know each other, but I've been thinking all night, and I have a proposition for you." Margaret's eyebrows rose slightly, but she didn't speak. "I'm heading to Montana, where my brother has a ranch. It's hard country, but it's honest work, and there's a chance to build something real there. I could use a wife, and you could use a new start." Jake paused, his heart hammering. "I'm not a wealthy man, and I can't promise you an easy life. But I can promise you this: I'll treat you with respect. I'll work hard to provide for you, and you'll never have to face the world alone again." Margaret stared at him in complete shock. Of all the things she might have expected this morning, A marriage proposal from a cowboy she had met yesterday was not one of them. "I don't understand," she said finally. "You don't even know me." "I know enough," Jake said steadily. "I know you're brave enough to travel halfway across the country for a chance at happiness. I know you're kind. I've seen how you treat Mrs. Henderson and the other people in town. I know you're strong because you've been facing disappointment every day for weeks and you're still here, still hoping." Margaret's hands trembled as she pressed them to her cheeks. "This is crazy. People don't just marry strangers. People do it all the time out here," Jake said gently. "Mail-order brides, arranged marriages, partnerships that turn into something more. Sometimes the best relationships start with practical needs instead of romantic dreams." "But I don't love you," Margaret said, the words coming out in a rush. "I don't love you either," Jake replied honestly. "But I respect you, and I think you respect me. That's more than a lot of married couples start with. Love might come later, or it might not. But we'd be partners, helping each other build something better than what either of us could manage alone." Margaret turned away from him, walking to the edge of the platform. Jake watched her struggle with the decision, understanding that he was asking her to give up her dreams and take a leap of faith with a virtual stranger. Margaret barely slept that night. She lay in her narrow bed at Mrs. Henderson's boarding house, staring at the ceiling and thinking about Jake's proposal. Every time she closed her eyes, she could see his weathered face, hear his steady voice, saying those impossible words, "I could use a wife and you could use a new start." The idea was so different from everything she had imagined for her life. Thomas had written romantic letters about love and devotion, painting pictures of a fairy tale life together. Jake had offered something entirely different: honesty, partnership, and the chance to build something real together. No grand promises, no talk of love, just the practical offer of two people helping each other survive. As dawn broke over Willow Creek, Margaret got up and dressed with extra care. She had been wearing the same rotation of 3 dresses for weeks now, but today she chose her best one, a simple brown dress that brought out the color of her eyes. If she was going to make the most important decision of her life, she wanted to look like someone who deserved respect. Mrs. Henderson was already bustling around the kitchen when Margaret came downstairs. The older woman took one look at Margaret's face and seemed to understand that something significant was happening. "You didn't sleep much, did you, dear?" Mrs. Henderson asked gently, pouring Margaret a cup of strong coffee. Margaret shook her head. "I have a big decision to make today." Mrs. Henderson nodded knowingly. "About that young cowboy who's been asking questions about you?" Margaret's cup paused halfway to her lips. "He's been asking about me?" "Oh, nothing improper," Mrs. Henderson said quickly. "Just the kinds of questions a decent man asks when he's thinking about a woman's situation. He wanted to know if you had family, if you had anywhere to go, if things didn't work out with this Thomas fellow." Margaret felt her cheeks warm. Jake had been thinking about her situation even before he made his proposal. It wasn't a sudden impulse. He had been considering it carefully. "Mrs. Henderson," Margaret said slowly, "what do you think of him?" "Jake, I mean." The older woman sat down across from Margaret, her expression serious. "I've been running this boarding house for 15 years, dear. I've seen all kinds of men come through here. Some are good, some are bad, and most are somewhere in between. But that Jake Morrison, he's one of the good ones." "How can you tell?" "Little things," Mrs. Henderson said. "The way he talks to people, like everyone deserves respect regardless of their station. The way he helped me carry firewood yesterday without being asked. The way he's been worried about you, a woman he barely knows." She paused, studying Margaret's face. "He's not flashy or smooth-talking, but he's solid, the kind of man you can depend on." Margaret nodded slowly. Thomas had been smooth-talking in his letters, full of flowery words and grand promises, and where had that gotten her? After breakfast, Margaret walked to the train station as she had every morning for nearly a month. But this time she wasn't going to wait for Thomas. She was going to think about Jake's offer and what it would mean for her future. The morning was crisp and clear, with the kind of bright autumn sky that made everything seem possible. Margaret sat on her usual bench, but instead of watching the horizon for approaching trains, she found herself thinking about what Jake had told her about his life. He had lost his father and his ranch, just as she had lost her job and her home. He had been drifting for 3 years, looking for something solid to build his life on. They were both alone, both searching for something they couldn't find by themselves. When Jake appeared at the platform around mid-morning, Margaret wasn't surprised. She had been expecting him, hoping he would come so they could talk more about his proposal. "Good morning," he said, settling beside her on the bench. "How are you feeling today?" "Confused," Margaret admitted. "I've been thinking about what you said, and I keep going back and forth." Jake nodded. "That's natural. It's a big decision." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the town wake up around them. A few people passed by, nodding politely, and Margaret realized that she had become part of the daily rhythm of Willow Creek. People expected to see her here, just as they expected to see the sunrise each morning. "Tell me about Montana," Margaret said eventually. "What's it really like?" Jake's eyes grew distant as he thought about it. "It's beautiful country, but it's hard. The winters are long and cold, and the work never stops. But there's something about it, the mountains, the wide open spaces, the feeling that you can build something that will last." He paused. "My brother's ranch is in a valley surrounded by hills. There's a stream that runs through it, and in the summer, the wildflowers cover the meadows like a carpet." Margaret could hear the longing in his voice. This wasn't just about work for him, it was about finding a place to belong. "What would I do there?" she asked. "I don't know anything about ranching." "You'd learn," Jake said simply. "You're smart, and you're not afraid of hard work. There's plenty to do on a ranch, cooking, gardening, helping with the animals, keeping the books. And once we get established, there might be opportunities to start a school or help other families in the area." Margaret felt a flutter of excitement at the idea. She had always been good with numbers, and she had enjoyed the few opportunities she'd had to help children with their reading. The possibility of being useful, of building something meaningful, was appealing in a way that Thomas's vague promises had never been. "Jake," she said carefully, "if I said yes, what would you expect from me? I mean, what kind of marriage would this be?" Jake was quiet for a long moment, clearly choosing his words carefully. "I'd expect you to be my partner," he said finally. "We'd work together, support each other, and try to build something good. As for the personal side of marriage, that would be up to you. I'm not looking for a servant or someone who's just grateful for rescue. I'm looking for an equal partner." Margaret felt something tight in her chest loosen. Jake wasn't offering to save her out of pity. He was offering a genuine partnership, a chance to build something together. "I have conditions," she said suddenly. The words coming out before she had fully thought them through. Jake turned to look at her, his expression serious. "What kind of conditions?" "If we do this, we get married here in Willow Creek before we leave. I want it to be legal and proper with witnesses." "Agreed," Jake said without hesitation. "And during the journey to Montana, we take time to really get to know each other. No pressure, no expectations, just two people learning about each other." "That makes sense," Jake nodded. "And if either of us decides this isn't working, if we can't stand each other, or if we realize we made a mistake, we part ways honorably. No hard feelings, no blame." Jake extended his hand toward her. "Deal." Margaret looked at his hand, calloused from years of hard work, but steady and strong. She thought about Thomas's hands, which she had never seen, and about the promises he had made and broken. Then she thought about Jake's honest proposal, his practical approach to building a life together. She took his hand and shook it firmly. "Deal!" Jake's face broke into the first real smile Margaret had seen from him. "So you'll marry me?" "I'll marry you," Margaret said, and felt a weight lift from her shoulders that she hadn't even realized she'd been carrying. They spent the rest of the morning making plans. Jake had enough money for a simple ceremony and train tickets to Montana. Margaret had barely enough to contribute to their traveling expenses, but Jake assured her that her contribution would be her partnership, not her money. They decided to Marry the next day, giving them time to arrange everything properly. Jake went to speak with the minister at the small church, while Margaret visited Ruth Miller to ask if she and her husband would serve as witnesses. Ruth was delighted by the news, though she was concerned about the speed of the decision. "Are you sure about this, Margaret? You've only known him for 2 days." "I'm sure," Margaret said, and realized she meant it. "I've been waiting for nearly a month for a man who made me pretty promises and then abandoned me. Jake is offering me something real, a chance to build a life with someone who keeps his word." The wedding ceremony took place the next afternoon in the small church at the center of town. Margaret wore her best dress, and Jake had somehow managed to find a clean shirt and tie. The minister, an elderly man named Father Williams, performed a simple but moving ceremony. Mrs. Henderson had insisted on providing a small reception afterward, with cake and coffee for the few people who had gathered to witness the marriage. Margaret was touched by how the townspeople had embraced her, even though she had been a stranger just a month ago. The sun began to set. Margaret and Jake walked together to the train station for the last time. Margaret carried a small bag with her few possessions, and Jake had his worn leather satchel. They stood on the platform where they had first met, waiting for the evening train that would take them north to Montana. Margaret reached into her purse and pulled out Thomas's letter, the one she had read so many times it was falling apart. She looked at it for a long moment, then walked to the bench where she had spent so many hours waiting and placed it there, weighing it down with a small stone. "No regrets?" Jake asked gently. Margaret looked back at the letter, then at her new husband. "No regrets," she said firmly. "Thomas gave me pretty words and empty promises.